Bava Batra Daf Pei Aleph Abud Aleph and Amud Beis, mitigating risks, Sefukei Mesapkelu. So risk management in finance is the evaluation of the extent of a risk against the cost of mitigating a risk. We're constantly facing risks. We do that our whole life involves risk mitigation to various different degrees because life is risky. And we're constantly evaluating the amount of the risk and the cost to mitigate the risk, and that's how we manage our risks. We're expected to do the same in the Olam HaRuchni, in the spiritual world. And we had two days ago on Daf Ayin Ches, we talked about the Moshlim, those who have mastery over themselves. We talked about having מחשב, הפסד, מצוה, כנגד, שכרה, ושכר עבירה, כנגד הפסדה. And Rabbi Simcha Zissel spoke about the importance of accuracy in the way you manage your risk, in the way you keep your accounts, so that one can make honest decisions. That you've got to consider the cost of a mitzvah against the reward of a mitzvah. You have to accept there is cost to a mitzvah and there is reward. There is reward in an avera, in a transgression, there is benefit, but there's a cost to it. And you've got to look at the two. And if you manage the risk in spiritual matters in the same way that you manage the risks, your risks in financial or in health matters, in any other area, one will be able to live a straight and a proper life. So we'll see this underlying principle in our Gemara. We're going to look at a machlokas between another two giants from the 18th century, the Pnei Yehoshua and the Kuntras HaSfekos. The Pnei Yehoshua was a little bit before the Kuntras HaSfekos. The Kuntras HaSfekos was the brother of the Ktsos HaChoshen. And the Ktsos HaChoshen regards him enormously highly, has very great respect for his brother. And they have a difference of opinion which we'll have a look at, and from that we'll understand this idea of spiritual risk mitigation. It starts with a posuk in Chumash in Parshas Ki Tavo, next week's parsha, where you have to bring the bikurim, you have to bring your first fruit and declare. V'ata hinei heveti et reshit pri ha'adama. I have now brought to you the first offerings of the fruit of the land, Asher natata li, Hashem, which you, Hashem, have given me. And you put it before the Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash, and that's what you do. You give it to the Kohanim and so on. The emphasis on the words Asher natatali, the land that you have given to me. In our Mishnah on Pei Aleph Amud Aleph, we have a machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbanan. We have a case there of a person buys two trees in a field. He only buys the trees. Now we discussed this Mishnah when we learned the Tosfos back on Daf Lamed Zayin, Amud Beis, and we have a Matmonim on trees that we talked about, and this Mishnah came up at that time. And here the issue is, has the buyer of the trees bought any of the land as well? All he sold was the tree, the contract is for trees. Is there an implied sale of the land between the trees or around the trees, or isn't there? The Chachomim say if there are two trees, then you've bought no land. Rabbi Meir says you have bought land. If it's one tree, you definitely haven't. If it's three trees, you definitely have. In two trees, there's the argument. Then the Gemara starts off by bringing another Mishnah, the Mishnah in Bikurim. Tanan Hatam, we learned there. Hakoneh shnei ilanot betoch shel chaviro. So it's the same case. You bought two trees in your friend's property. Now the question is, do you bring bikurim from those two trees or don't you? That's the issue. What's the issue? The Chachomim say, Mevi ve'enokor, you bring the bikurim, but you don't say the piece. You just bring the bikurim. Rabbi Meir omer mevi ve'koreh. Rabbi Meir says, no, you bring and you read. Why? Explains the Rashbam. Because the question is, have you bought land or haven't you? When you say the piece for the bikurim, you've got to say, Adama asher natatali, the land you've given to me, which means the fruit comes from a piece of land that belongs to me. But if the land doesn't belong to me, how can I say that? It says the Chachamim, if you bought two trees, the land does not belong to you, and so you can bring, but you can't you can't say the piece that you have to say. Rabbi Meir says the land does belong to you, so there's no reason why you can't say it. The Gemara goes on Amud Beis and says, "My time at Rabbi Meir bi ilan echad, or my time at Rabbanan b'shnei ilanot." What is the reason for both Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanan? Explains the Rashbam. Either way, if you say you don't own the land and therefore the fruit doesn't come from your land, then you shouldn't have to bring either. Why are you bringing? Because both the bringing and the recital is dependent on owning the land. So either way, if you don't own the land, you shouldn't bring, you shouldn't recite. If you do own the land, you should bring and you should recite. What is this that you bring but you don't recite? Answers the Gemara. Omar Rabba, my kushya, what's the question? Dilme Rabbi Meir bi'ilan echad sefukei mesapkele. What might be the case is that the Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanim, the authors of this Mishnah, are not actually sure what the din is. How does Hashem look at the sale? A man buys 2 trees, they don't talk about the land, he just buys the trees. Because it doesn't really make a difference if he owns the land or not. Later on there can be issues around whether he owns the land or not. And when it comes to Bikurim, but they didn't think of Bikurim at the time they did the contract, they just sold 2 trees. What was the understanding? What is the implied understanding? It's possible, says the Gemara, that the Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanan actually don't know what the implied understanding is. And the difference is whether it's with 1 tree or with 2 trees, but in both cases, sefukei mesapkei, they have a doubt. They don't know. This is left in doubt. And since it's left in doubt, you bring the Bikurim, but you don't recite the Bikurim. If you recite the Bikurim, you might be saying something which is completely untrue. So you don't recite it, but you bring the Bikurim so that you haven't forgone the mitzvah of Bikurim altogether. The Rashbam says something that sets the Achronim up into crazy discussions. Crazy just in the sense of complexity and wild. Mesapkelu, says the Rashbam, Mesapkelu ikana karka min hadin or lo. The Rabbanan and Rabbi Meir are not sure as to whether in this case where only the trees have been purchased but not the land, there's been no reference to the land, they're not sure as to what the implication was. Halachically, was the land sold or was the land not sold? And therefore you've got to bring and not say. Asks the Rashbam, V'hai da'amri lo kana karka. But it says in the Mishnah quite clearly, in our Mishnah, it says, Hakoneh shnei ilanot b'toch sadeh chaveiro, harei zeh lo kana karka. The Mishnah doesn't say maybe he hasn't bought the karka. It's a sofek, we don't know whether he's bought the land. The Mishnah makes a clear statement, he hasn't bought the land. And if he hasn't bought the land, why would he be bringing Bikurim, even without saying it? Why would there be any thought of bringing the Bikurim if he doesn't own the land? Asks the Rashbam. Answers the Rashbam, Mishainu mishum de yada mocher al ha'elyona. That's because in the question of ownership, the seller is in the better position. He has the power. De misfeke lo mafkinen minei, because we don't remove property if you have a sofek. So we don't know whether the property is included in the deal or it isn't. The Rabbanan don't know. The Rabbi Meir doesn't know. Nobody knows whether in such a case the property is included or not. Well, if it's a doubt, if it's a sofek, you can't take money away from somebody when you're in doubt. You can only take something away from somebody when they're not in doubt. So the question comes back, and that's what the Achronim get really interested in. So if we've decided that this is a sofek, and because it's a sofek, we cannot take the money away from him, because it's a doubt, we cannot take the field away from him, that means he retains ownership of the field, as he always did in the past. If he retains ownership in the field, why does the buyer bring Bikurim altogether? The question just comes back again. So Reb Shimon Shkop in the Shaira Yoshua references the famous machloikus between the Pnei Yoshua and the Kuntras Asfekus, which I mentioned in the opening. And to understand the machloikus, we have to understand 3 types of chazakot, 3 types of assumptions. The one is an assumption that we use not only in monetary matters, but we use it in Isurim as well. We use it in Yoredeh. It's called a chazoka kamaisa. If you don't know that status has changed, you leave the status quo. So if a young woman goes off to the United States for 2 years and she comes back, and we haven't heard that she's had a wedding, she doesn't come back with a husband, she doesn't come back with children, we assume when she left she was single, we assume she's come back, we assume she's single. We don't change status out of doubt. If a woman is a nidah, if a woman is halachically impure, and we're not sure whether the mikveh she went to was a kosher mikveh or it wasn't a kosher mikveh, we leave the status as it was. If we're not sure, we know for sure she was a nidah, we don't know that anything's changed, leave it as the status quo. That's a chazaka kamaisa. Then we have the idea of muchzak, which we've used a lot in Nezikin, which is if somebody has possession, if somebody's holding an item, that's a chazaka. We assume it's his. You can't just come along and say, the Simon has just come in. You can't just walk in and say that gold Rolex that you're wearing is mine. And I say, Simon, you've got any proof that it's yours? He says, no, just it's mine. That doesn't even create a suffix. It's nothing. I'm a muchzak. That's the idea of muchzak. And then we have in the laws of Mamonos, in mandatory laws, we have the idea of a cheskes marekama. A cheskes marekama means we're not sure who owns it now, but we do know that a month ago I owned the golden Rolex. Now we're not sure. Maybe Simon owns it, maybe I own it. We're not sure. We've got no way of establishing, but we know for sure I used to own it, and we don't know anything's happened to change that. That's a cheskes marekama. The Pnei Yeshua and the Quintras Asfekis argue about this cheskes marekama in the laws of in mandatory laws, in the Zikin, in Choshen Mishpat. Is that similar to the law that we have in Isurim? That if you don't know that the status has changed, you leave it unchanged. Is it that kind of a concept? Or is it more like muchzak? That we know I owned it, it was my watch a month ago, I had it, so we assume it's still mine, we assume I'm still muchzak. What is the nature of this cheskes marekama, the chazaka that we leave it in the original owner's possession? And the Kuntras Asfekis concludes this is not the same as Isurim, and therefore, when a cheskes marekama is used in mandatory laws, it cannot be used to resolve a doubt in Isurim, in laws of Isur V'Heter, in ritual laws. There we can't use the same principle to resolve the doubt. The Shaira Yosher, Reb Shimon Shkop, proves that the Kuntras Asfekis is right from our Gemara. And he says, what do we have here? We have a cheskes marekama. We don't know whether this property, the land between the trees, has been transferred from the original owner to the buyer. Rabbi Meir doesn't know, the Chachomim doesn't know, the Mishnah doesn't know, the Gemara doesn't know, nobody knows. But we do know it used to belong to the seller, so we leave it in the hands of the seller. However, the buyer still has to bring bikurim. Says Reb Shimon Shkop, you see from there, that this cheskes marekama that we use in the laws of Mamonot, that we use in Choshen Mishpat, in mandatory laws, doesn't help us to resolve sfeikot in the area of Isur V'Heter. There the sfeikot cannot be resolved. That's what Reb Shimon Shkop brings the proof from here. And a major discussion ensues in the Achronim, which we won't get into. But I just want to go a level deeper in understanding philosophically, why not? Why don't we say, as the Pnei Yeshua would say, and others, why don't we say, the fact is we don't know if this property has been transferred from first owner to second owner? Nobody knows. And where we have a sofik, lo mafkinen minei, we don't take it away from him. And therefore the psak is, this property still belongs to the original owner. Why don't we say, if that's the psak, that this property still belongs to the original owner, how can the buyer say, Ha'adama asher natata li Hashem, the land which you gave me, Hashem, this is not my land. We've paskened that the land belongs to the first owner. Who cares how we reached that psak? If the decision is that the land belongs to the first owner, that should be the way it is. That's how we should leave it, and it should be that way for all issues. Why is it so different? And we have to go a little bit deeper into understanding this principle of the misfeike loy mafkinan mineh, and then we'll understand that that same principle by which we don't remove the property if we're not sure that the property is being transferred, that same principle governs the fact that the buyer has to bring the bikurim. Why? Because look at the words of misfeike loy mafkinan mineh. He doesn't say amotzi michaveru alav haraya. He doesn't use any of the other words the Gemara often uses. The Rashbam uses the misfeike. When you're in doubt, you can't take something away from somebody. You've got to be certain to take something away from somebody. And for that one has to understand the pain of loss. If you consider human fear, you can try the exercise yourself. I often do it with people, to write down all the things you fear most. You'll notice there's a common denominator. They are all fear of loss. The only thing we fear is loss. There's nothing else we fear. Loss of life, loss of loved ones, loss of money, loss of job, loss of dignity, loss of status, All we fear is loss. There's nothing else to fear. And that's why if you don't have anything, if you've got nothing to lose, one can be fearless, one can be very courageous, because our fears are all based on loss. Since Adam HaRishon lost Gan Eden, the pain of that loss was so deep that we don't like losing. Even if we lose little things, we just lose our car keys for a few minutes, we get irritated. We don't like to lose things. Loss is terrible. So to take something away from somebody, that's gzelah. You don't take something away from somebody unless you're certain it doesn't belong to them. And a Beis Din has to be very careful about that. You don't cause somebody the terrible suffering of loss if you're not certain, if you're not sure. And that loss, as the Baalei Musar, Rabbi Yisrael and others speak about, that's not just physical loss. You don't take honor away from somebody. You don't take dignity away from somebody. You don't take a position away from somebody. And that's why we've got laws of chazokas. Even the shul, there's one person who's been the gabber for years. You don't just fire him. You don't just change him out unless the original understanding was he's only the gabber for a year. If somebody gives the drosha every Shabbos, somebody gives a shir, you don't just switch him out. You can't take something away from somebody. That's gezela. And gezela is not only in physical areas. Gezela is in spiritual areas as well. The misfeika lo mafkinen minei. You don't take things away from people misofik. So we don't know if this field really has passed or it hasn't passed, so we leave it with the original owner. Now let's switch, and let's look at the buyer from the perspective of his responsibility to bring bikurim. And let's look at it from the lashon of a chiyuv. What does a chiyuv mean? A chiyuv is an obligation, but a chiyuv is also the word we use for indebtedness. So when we are chayev, we have an obligation. In a few minutes, we've got to say Kriyat Shema. We are chayev. We're obligated to say Kriyat Shema. We're obligated to daven. There are things we're obligated tonight to make kiddush and to keep Shabbos. These are chiyuvim. Think of a chiyuv as a debt. You're obligated until you've requited yourself. You owe that to Hashem. You owe Hashem a kiddush tonight. You owe Hashem a Kriyat Shema. And until you've done that and you've fulfilled your obligation, you're carrying that indebtedness. So if we look at it now and we say, so this buyer, does he owe the Ribono Shel Olam anything? It's the question. Is he chayev bikurim? Does he have to bring bikurim? Does he have a debt? So what did we say earlier? You don't take something away from somebody misofik. You mitigate the risk of causing loss. You mitigate the risk of theft. Taking something away from somebody is a terrible thing. So don't take it. If you're in doubt, the way you mitigate the risk is if you're in doubt. If you're not certain, you don't take it away. What about your obligation to Hashem? If you're in doubt about your obligation to Hashem, especially if it's a mitzvah d'oraisa, so that's the idea of sofek d'oraisa l'chumra. If you're in doubt, you mitigate the risk by going l'chumra. What's the big deal? It's a low cost. If you've got to be evei mechashed efsed mitzvah k'neged sechara, the cost of doing the mitzvah is low. And look at the schar, you've got a mitzvah. How can you run the risk that this man might be chayev bikurim and you don't let him do bikurim because there's a sofek, because you're not sure the land is his? So exactly the same reason of misfeika lo mafkinen minei. You don't take the land away from the first owner because you're in doubt. You don't take the mitzvahs bikurim away from the buyer because you're in doubt. The first owner owns the land, and the buyer brings the bikurim. Both because of the principle of misfeika lo mafkinen minei. Don't cause a person loss unless you're sure. Don't cause a person financial loss unless you're sure of your case. And don't cause a person yourself spiritual loss unless you're sure that you're not chayev, that you don't have an obligation altogether.